Thank you to everyone for joining us. We're really excited to be launching our report today and also telling you about our study, which was engaging those using harmful technological behaviours, and we use the story completion approach. Those in the room will have a copy of the report here. However, those online, you can actually view a copy. We're actually popping the link to that in the chat at the moment. Otherwise, you can also find it on the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. And while I am speaking to people in the room, can everyone make sure that they've got their phones switched to silent? Thank you very much. So we would like to thank the Melbourne Social Equity Institute for investing in our study. MSEI are known for their support of interdisciplinary research that addresses social inequities, and they're particularly kind to early career researchers. The majority of this team were that, so thank you very much to MSEI. Okay, before we move into the presentation, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting today. We pay our respects to the Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples, especially to their elders, both past and present, and we thank them for the care that they've taken of the lands and the waterways, and extend this thanks to the traditional owners of all University of Melbourne campuses. So that includes the Yorta Yorta peoples, the Bunurong and the Dja Dja Wurrung as well. We recognise our role in caring for the land while we are upon it, and know that it has always and will be, always will be, Aboriginal land. I'm going to introduce you to my colleagues in just a moment. However, first I wanted to let everyone know that we are going to be discussing some potentially sensitive issues today. Throughout this session, I guess that what it's probably worthwhile me doing right now is popping a few links into the chat, which I will try and do. However, if you are distressed from the content that we discussed today and you are in the room, please let me know at some point, or let someone in the room know, and we will certainly follow up with some support for you. So it's my pleasure now to introduce my colleagues. The very first is fabulous Dr. Cynthia Brown. So Cynthia Brown is a University of Melbourne researcher on technology facilitated abuse and intimate partner violence. Next to her is Dr. Dana McKay, a senior lecturer in innovative interactive technologies at the School of Computing at RMIT. Next to Dana is Bridget, sorry, who is the Deputy Director of the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre and Associate Professor of Criminology at Monash University. And I'm Dr. Renee Fiolet. I am a postdoc research fellow in knowledge translation down at the Institute of Health Transformation at Deakin University. We're also pleased to introduce Dr. Kobe Lyons, who is an international lawyer with corporate, academic and policy experience in digital ethics, disarmament and human rights. Kobe isn't presenting today, but she is joining us in the room. And our team has also benefited from the contribution of Miss Sally Marsden, Dr. Delaney Woodlock, Dr. Charlotte Miller and Mr. Vibelhoy, who I believe are joining us on the line. On the line. I work in technology. That line. Okay, so just giving a little bit of background to everyone, intimate partner violence and domestic abuse are human rights violations that are recognised as significant contributors to morbidity and mortality globally. All genders experience IPV and domestic abuse. However, women are disproportionately impacted, with global evidence suggesting that 1 in 3 have experienced some form of intimate partner violence or domestic abuse. Many forms of domestic abuse actually exist, but research has predominantly focused on physical and sexual forms of those behaviours. Technology facilitated abuse in relationships, we call it TAR or TAR, is relatively recent in regards to patterns of abuse, and it involves intentional misuse of technology with an intention for coercive control in intimate and familial contexts. It is frequently referred to as digital coercive control, digital dating abuse, or cyber dating abuse. I guess technology can be used to enact sexual, financial, emotional, or psychological abuse. and it can also facilitate in-person stalking. However, there are also distinct acts that involving digital media and devices that have been observed and recorded in the literature. Commonly deployed TAR behaviours include, but aren't limited to, online stalking and tracking, harassment and threats made through messaging, checking of mobile phones without permission, doxing, sharing of personal information and images, destroying or denying access to devices or digital accounts, impersonation, demanding of passwords, and other behaviours that are intended to humiliate, harass, coerce or control a target. So commonly those experiencing TAR, they speak to the fear that results from victimisation. The omnipresence afforded through the use of technology means that TAR feels inescapable. The impacts of TAR include poor mental health outcomes such as anxiety, sleeping disorders and depression. It's a method of abuse that can be hard for the victim survivor to detect and to prove. And that can prompt the perpetrator to engage in gaslighting behaviours, leading to further deterioration in the victim survivor's health. In addition to threatening a victim survivor's well-being, their safety and security is also undermined when there are failures of the justice system to recognise and regulate TAR. So there is a growing evidence which quite rightly focuses on victim survivors' experiences of TAR and its enduring effects and advocates for reforms in prevention. It is vitally important that we do focus on the voices of victim survivors and facilitate a healing journey for them. Equally, to support and protect victim survivors, we must determine how to regulate and prevent TAR from occurring. So to do so, I went to change it here. To do so, it is imperative that we examine the practices perpetrators engage in and their explanations for those actions. With this knowledge, we can locate opportunities to interrupt patterns and challenge behaviours and actions before that they occur. These insights are also needed to inform primary prevention initiatives and by agencies that work with perpetrators and involuntary and mandated behaviour change programs. So the aim of this research was to establish the emotions and motivations that may influence a perpetrator's choice to engage in tech-facilitated behaviours. With these insights, strategies for the IPV and domestic abuse sector and services that seek to disrupt violence, as well as recommendations for reform to the tech industry can be gleaned. So I'll now hand over to Cynthia, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we did.
Thank you, Renee. It's going to work. Perfect. So in order to undertake our study, we used a novel form of narrative inquiry known as the story completion method to explore narratives around the motives and behavioural choices for engaging in tech-facilitated abuse. The story completion method, if you haven't heard of it, is particularly useful for exploring sensitive topics where the content or the topic of research is uncomfortable to discuss, socially undesirable, or even perhaps illegal. So the method involves presenting participants with hypothetical scenarios in the form of story stems for stories that the participants are then invited to complete. So story completion helps participants to distance themselves from the characters that they are talking about in the story, to relax their guard, if you like, and to discuss or reflect on the research topic with less reserve. So this feature of sort of distance from the topic, in combination with the anonymity afforded by the way that we applied the method, which I'll talk about shortly, makes the method particularly useful for conducting research among hard-to-reach populations, such as those who perpetrate abuse. So in our case, the story stems reflected a range of possible scenarios where varying forms of tech-facilitated abuse may occur. Online, we presented one generic story stem to all participants and then one second randomly selected story stem to each participant. The generic scenario was one where a couple were having relationship difficulties, one partner was upstairs asleep, the other partner was downstairs worrying about the relationship, and noticed that the sleeping partner's phone and laptop was on the table. The participant was asked to write about what the worrying partner thought, did and felt, and why they chose that course of action. Other scenarios that were randomly presented include a scenario where the couple recently split and one party was scrolling through photos and videos that they had taken together, including some intimately explicit material. Again, the participant was asked to write about what the scrolling character thought, felt and did and why. So therefore tapping into their thoughts about what could happen in the scenario. Other scenarios use different variations of the troubled relationship and also different variations of the recent relationship split, as well as things involving home automation, setting up of new devices and unexpected changes of behaviours that one partner is noticing in the other partner in the relationship. So you can see there's quite a range of scenarios, but all scenarios that may lead to tech-facilitated abusive behaviours. To facilitate inclusivity, each story used names that were not explicitly gendered in the Australian context. One thing that was very interesting to note in the completion of the stories was that most participants wrote in the third person. However, some wrote in the first person and some alternated between the two, which makes it really important to emphasise that the stories created by the participants may reflect their real underlying motives and desires, or they may equally reflect present day discourses to which participants have been exposed. So participants were recruited online by multiple sources, including social media, organisational newsletters, community organisations, and all elements of the research were undertaken online and anonymously. Participant consent was required, of course, and participants needed to meet some inclusion criteria. So they needed to be 18 years or older. And to avoid the risk of resumption of or escalation of abuse against a current partner, the sample was limited to participants who were not in a current relationship. Also, to avoid individuals including or excluding themselves based on their own interpretations of the word abuse, tech-facilitated abuse behaviours were collectively referred to as harmful use of technology, or participants who had previously used technology in a way that would have upset their partner or would have had their partner known about it. So we purposefully didn't use the word abuse in any of our direct communication with participants. Participant anonymity was really important and maintained through anonymous online participation, the assignment of a unique identifier to each participant, and the social distance inherently offered by the method when we conducted the research online. And a little bit about who our participants were. So we had 35 participants, which translated into 70 completed stories, one of the generic story and one of the randomly allocated stories. Of the 35 participants, 22 identified as men, 12 as women, and one person identified as non-binary. 57% of our participants were aged 26 to 35, 37% 18 to 25, and about 6% in the 36 to 45 year age bracket. Most participants were heterosexual, 2 identified as being gay, 2 as bisexual, and 1 as pansexual. All but 2 were born in Australia. All but 1 had completed secondary school education, and a third of participants had either a bachelor degree or postgrad quals of some sort, and a third were in a trade of some description or another. That essentially concludes the sort of the high-level summary of what we did and who our participants were. But before we talk about our findings, we wanted to note that we had hoped to interview or conduct interviews with some of the participants to further explore and extend our findings. But despite some of the participants saying that they were willing to do that, we were ultimately unable to secure a single interview with any of the participants. And in hindsight, we believe this speaks really directly to the utility and the value of the arm's length nature of the story completion method in enabling us to access this sort of hard to reach population. So I'll now pass back to Renee to talk about some of our findings.
Thanks, Cynthia. So 3 overarching themes were identified in our reflexive thematic analysis, which followed Braun and Clark's work. Abusive behaviours and negative emotions speaks to the anger and or sadness that often precedes a decision to abuse a partner using technology. A loss of trust, a desire for control in the relationship describes the motivations for the use of TAR. And finally, inhibitors of abusive behaviours explores some of the rationales perpetrators use for avoidance of TAR behaviours and indicate that there is potential to work with this group on refraining from using technology to abuse. So looking a little bit further at the theme of abusive behaviours and negative emotions, we found that there are many emotions that influence the choice to use technology in abusive ways. The most cited emotions were anger, fear, suspicion of betrayal, and sadness. Most participants identified anger as a strong emotion present in their narrative decision-making about technological facilitated abuse. You can see from the first quote on the slide there that the anger could be quite extreme in some cases. Fear and suspicion of betrayal were commonly noted emotions that overlapped with motivators for using tech-facilitated abuse. The fear was often related to not knowing about what was going on with a partner. Some of the suspicions didn't even appear to have real true basis. For example, one participant spoke of becoming suspicious because their partner hadn't contacted them in 2 hours. Another indicated that a late night message coming through on the partner's phone is very suspicious. So it often didn't take much for suspicion to be roused. Another frequently cited emotion in the stories was sadness, but that sorrow generally spoke to them tending to be sad about perceived betrayal, or that they had picked up on something that was going on with the partner, rather than sadness actually motivating the inappropriate behaviours or responses. So our second theme, the loss of trust and the desire for control, I guess identified that most participants actually perceived that a loss of control in their relationship was justification for them to use TAR behaviours. There were times when the motivation to address betrayal was provided as a justification for the act, even if there was no evidence that there had actually been a betrayal. There were instances when the participant expressed an explicit desire for control in their relationship. And as you can see with the quote here about Sam's control of Ash, and some participants were able to actually identify that they are controlling in nature, such as Alex's partner here. And although there were many accounts where characters pursued TAR, there were many examples too where the fictional perpetrators recognised that such harms complicated their relationships, it upset their partners, and it fostered mistrust. So this realisation caused some of them to reconsider actually using TAR. Although some seem to realise that they should avoid it because they actually wanted to avoid using illegal acts, there were others, such as the participant quote, the second one on the screen there, who genuinely recognised that they respected their partner's privacy too much to engage in those harmful behaviours. So moving on now to Dana.
So Renee's done a fantastic job of telling you what we found about the people in this study. As a technologist and as someone who believes that technology doesn't have to be the way it is, I wanted to know what we could learn about the technology so that we can hopefully redesign it so that it's basically not as appealing or useful in these contexts. So we went through a bunch of things and we found some potentially harmful uses of technology. This is probably the most high-tech example that we'll talk about, which is the life logging example. I know there's one person in the room who is interested in smart homes. The smart home example, interestingly, although I only had 4 participants, didn't generate much interest from our participants. So it seems that that one hasn't quite caught on at scale yet. But I think that's only a matter of time. So life logging software. The first example is in the context where Sam is setting up a mobile phone for Ash, their partner. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm going to add this thing called Life 360 that I've heard about, which basically means I can track Ash all the time, right? So that's a fairly high-tech example. Sam puts this on the phone. He's using this very high-tech software that he's heard about. And in this particular instance, it is a he. That's what the participant decided, not what we decided. But there are more general kind of consumer technologies that are being used in this way as well. So Find My, for example, is something that was mentioned by our participants. Oh, I don't know where they are. I'm going to use Find My to go off and find out where they are so that I can track them down. Many participants talked at looking at social media messages. So it used to be that when we had a conversation with people, it was either over the phone or face to face, and that once that conversation was gone, it was gone, right? Now we have these conversations in our social media all the time that leave all these traces, and participants did write stories about checking through all of those conversations so that they could see exactly what social engagements their partners were engaged in. And it wasn't just checking through their partner's social things, but also using the friends as a proxy to try and see what was going on with their partners. So if they couldn't find anything about their partner's social media because their partner had changed the password or whatever, they would go and look at the friends to see if they could see interactions between the partner and the friends to see what was going on with their partner. So this is a kind of a designed in feature of social media. We can see what our friends' friends are doing, but it's one that has very negative potential consequences. The other thing that they talked about was going on a fishing expedition through devices. They would look through documents, they would look through social media messages, they would look through folders on the device. They would look at financial transactions to see what was going on with their partners. So opens phone and laptop, searches social media platforms. This example happened to be followed up, and then searched through all folders to see if he could find ambiguous photos. In a situation where a partner had noticed different spending patterns, they immediately logged onto the banking app to see what was going on with those spending patterns because they were concerned that their partner had a different source of income. I mean, it was literally just framed as different spending patterns, buying more new jeans, and all of a sudden they're worried that their partner has a new income. So this is quite extreme, or it seems to me as a technologist to be extreme behavior in response to relatively minor behavioral changes. And of course, image-based abuse, non-consensually accessing and retaining images. So making copies of images when they find them, retaining images, intimate images after they've been asked to delete them. I know that with thematic analysis, we're not supposed to talk about numbers, but 6 participants responded to a story stub about being asked to delete intimate images, and most of them said, oh no, I would retain those, they're mine. So there's a real narrative around retaining those images. And of course, transmitting those images to other people as well. We also saw a lot of attempts to mask access to technology. So the person who installed Life 360 hid it amongst a bunch of exercise apps so that his partner wouldn't notice that this app had been installed. So it's not just using technology to enact abuse, it's also using sometimes technology and sometimes more simple mechanisms to hide abuse. So deleting search history, for example, but sometimes hiding it was much simpler than that, such as the person who took the devices into the toilet so that if their partner came downstairs, they wouldn't be seen using the phone or laptop. So what can technologists do to help? as a technologist myself and one who is interested in how the design of technology interacts with human behavior, and with the help of this team, I've identified 3 potential sets of interventions. The first is behavioral intervention. Social media and the social media business models are all about modeling human behavior and presenting content to us. If they can model normative behavior, they can also model abusive behavior and present things like, oh, here are some ads about services you may wish to access if you're using technology in a way your partner might not like, to help out, essentially. At present, social media is designed around no looking ever being presented to the person who's being looked at. There's a lot of information that social media companies have that we, as the kind of product that's being sold, don't have about people's interactions with information about us. Now, arguably, there's some commercial sides of this, but in an abuse situation, there is the potential for social media companies in particular to advise victim survivors that maybe someone's engaging with their profile in a way that looks like abuse. Now, of course, there are challenges around this. It's complicated. This whole space is complicated, and making sure that we do the right thing by victim survivors is complicated. But that is one potential. And similarly with, access traces on devices and those kinds of things. Another potential informational intervention is that we know that this type of behavior often escalates towards the end of a relationship, allowing people a takeout option. So Google already has a takeout option for data that you've given them. But imagine if you could go to the social media company and say, I want a takeout option of anything that looks a bit dodgy around my profile. Imagine how useful that could potentially be in, for example, getting legal remedy to situations that are going on. And finally, we could be designing technology to just be less persuasive or actively engage in persuading against abusive behaviors. So Renee told you about some people who decided not to engage in abusive behaviors. Essentially, technology is designed to capture our eyeballs and keep them there. But it could equally be designed to say, hey, maybe it's time. Maybe you need to take a break. You've looked at this profile 23 times in the last hour. It hasn't changed. Is a 24th time really the best thing for you right now? So there are, particularly given that participants spoke about feelings of compulsion fairly regularly in the stories that they wrote, dialing down that compulsion and maybe even putting in some, not compulsions away from using technology, because that has a whole other set of problems that could also affect victim survivors, but just putting in some nudges of maybe this isn't the best thing to be doing. And some technology companies, in fairness, are already engaging in this, such as Instagram's messages of, hey, that thing you're about to post looks like it might be abusive. Do you really want to post it? They've found that's very effective. So technology designers can absolutely be designing to kind of dial down the heat and even suggest alternative patterns of behavior that might be healthier for both the victim survivors, but also the abusers or perpetrators themselves.
So we're just going to finish up by talking about our, I have my glasses on, so it's a bit of a struggle. Recommendations. So we're really fortunate to have consulted with, excellent, thank you, consulted with a range of academics, non-government and government organisations in developing these, but really would emphasise that we do need a lot more consultation with all of these different groups and making sure we've got really diverse voices in the room. So the first recommendation we had was around safety by design. And so this is really about the government continuing to encourage tech developers to draw on the eSafety Commissioner's Safety by Design initiative as a foundation for tech that's marketed in Australia. So this initiative really prioritises user safety in design, in development, in deployment. And there are 3 basic principles. The first is that platforms and other companies are responsible for making user safety their #1 priority. And that means anticipating how it could be, I guess, co-opted, essentially, how it might facilitate, increase or encourage harm. So the burden is not solely on the user. The second principle is that users should have the power and autonomy to make decisions in their own best interest, and platforms and services really have to meaningfully engage with users. And this means engaging with diverse and at-risk groups and ensuring that the features and functions are accessible for all. The third idea is that platforms and companies are really transparent and accountable about their operations and their published safety objectives. And that means that users can gain insight into what safety risks there could be and also how they might be navigating these. So ultimately, what we're really recommending here is that our tech developers are creating and adhering to policies that's informed by an understanding of industry role in preventing and disrupting harmful behaviours. Now, Dana spoke to our next point, which is on the potential of nudges, prompts, AIs, and training. So we really think there's more opportunities to raise awareness and to deter harmful behaviours. So tech developers really can create and ensure their technologies can recognise some of these harmful behaviours, present nudges and prompts that might challenge or have people stop and think about their behaviours. And this is particularly something that might occur if they are exhibiting red flags. And these red flags could be, for instance, increased emotions, more frequent checking that Dana talked about. And as she mentioned, Meta has had quite a bit of success when they've used messages like, do you really want to post this? I think it's been quite a high percentage, it might be 68% or possibly more, a lot of success there. There are a few challenges here, but potentially we could be using AI in detecting and intervening in tech abuse. And we're really fortunate in Australia to have a government agency, the E-Safety Commissioner, and a non-government agency, WESNet, who have been training a whole host of different sectors, but in particular our domestic, family violence and sexual violence sectors. So I think it's really fair and accurate to say that in Australia we have the most upskilled domestic and family violence and sexual violence workforce around tech abuse. We do want to see a bit of that burden off these agencies and really encouraging our tech companies to do more training and to encourage some voluntary training and referrals for their staff, particularly in their public-facing roles. The next recommendation is around advancing and extending policy, practice and research. And so this, we'd like to see tech companies investing a portion of their budgets, often quite substantial budgets, into safety by design and to really advance online safety, awareness and training. And we think that this should be informed by sector involvement, but this should be paid sector involvement. We recognise that there is that knowledge and evidence gap around perpetration that Renee mentioned. We've had a lot of really great research on victimisation, but really not as much on perpetration and engaging perpetrators. So we'd really like to see some more research in this space, more exploration and evaluation of perpetrator behaviours. That is really going to give us that key intel on how we can interrupt harmful behaviours. The next one is...
No, it takes a minute.
Too impatient. Our next recommendations are just, we framed as response more broadly. So firstly, I mentioned that really great training we've had for the domestic family violence, sexual violence sector. We are increasingly seeing training with justice agencies, and this has really been fueled by some coronial inquests, some independent inquiries, as well as desires to upskill their workers in this space. We really recommend that this content is incorporated into existing training and that there are opportunities for further development for first responders. We'd also like to see more support for advocate awareness raising. We recognise that there's a lot of work being done by advocates. They're overburdened and under-resourced, especially our non-government agencies. So we'd like to see more sector support for advocates that are awareness raising in this space. Next, we'd like to see some recommendations around specialist and justice system engagement. And that is that researchers do work with our specialist domestic and family violence and sexual violence sector, our tech sector, but also our justice sector to build understanding of our victim survivor pathways and needs. To date, there's been quite a bit of engagement with our domestic family violence and sexual violence sector, and we need to recognise also that they're overburdened and under-resourced, so we don't want to see a replication of research here, and really the emphasis should be on our justice system engagement. There's been very little work done with, say, police, courts and corrections, and that is a real need to expand that information base. Next, we have some recommendations around prevention, and firstly around healthy relationships and social media programs. So recognising that there's been some really great work done around respectful relationships, and that some respondents in our study talked about how on reflection they saw their actions as unhealthy or harmful. We think there's an opportunity for the government to further incorporate tech facilitated abuse content into healthy relationship programs, and ideally throughout schools, so from the primary school level all the way through. We'd also recommend the government develop social media marketing programs that are challenging the cultures, norms, attitudes, and beliefs that can foster and fuel tech facilitated abuse. On education and increasing the role and impact of tech abuse, we think that service providers delivering primary prevention programs need to be providing more education on the role and impact of tech facilitated abuse in relationships. And really to date, we've been focusing on responding to as opposed to preventing tech abuse. So to that end, we're recommending that researchers are engaging more with people in the primary prevention space, and we're really focused on developing methods for raising awareness and countering tech abuse. And that means that we need to be thinking much more about gender and norms online, understanding broader risk, protective factors, maybe risk factors and tech abuse. Why do some people engage in tech abuse and others do not? And we saw our participants reflecting on what they were going to do and if they should or should not do different actions. And by that, we can really look at fostering positive behaviour change. In our justice system, we think there's quite a bit of work to do around operational policies, guides, and mechanisms for review, and recommend that we see police, courts, and corrections reviewing their operational policies and guides and making sure that this tech facilitated abuse is incorporated in content, in particular relating to sexual violence, domestic and family violence, stalking, and surveillance. So they're the behaviours that our participants were talking about. The justice system could also establish some quite simple legal and tech mechanisms for victim survivors to be able to hold technology companies accountable for devices and tools that where it would be reasonably foreseen that they could be used for abuse. We might think about things like spyware here, for instance. And in reviewing existing laws, or if we're talking about bringing in further laws, so here we could be thinking about coercive control laws, for instance, that we have our policymakers and regulators think about including tech tools for enacting harm. In our sorry, I don't have my glasses, so it's all a bit challenging. In regards to further training and mental health assessment, that was something that's definitely come through in our work, that we think there's an opportunity to provide more regular and ongoing training. We know training has to be ongoing, it can't be one-off, so more ongoing training about how technology is weaponized, particularly in those contexts, sexual, domestic and family violence, stalking and surveillance. That there's also training around risk factors associating with tech facilitated abuse. We know from some death reviews and emerging research that there's a connection between how tech is being used and also some sort of homicide flags, and so that fatal violence. That there's more consideration of intervention orders and breaches by technology, something that survivors have particularly called for, and that we consider how investigation, prosecution and offender management strategies might incorporate tech facilitated abuse. And really then thinking about the perpetrators in this element, thinking about how perpetrators might undergo more mental health assessment and treatment as part of the sentencing. There was a lot of talk about sort of healthy and unhealthy behaviours. In regards to research, there's definitely an urgent need, I would say, to look at how tech can be used in that risk assessment, that offender management process. And really what we'd also advocate for is making sure that all of this research is translated, open access, provided to these agencies that we're talking about. So for instance, it's accessible by police, courts, corrections. And lastly, we have recommendations around behaviour change programs. And essentially the first one is that we are including tech facilitated abuse in behaviour change programs throughout the duration of group work. And there's a number of avenues, a number of points in programs where they could be introduced. And that there's also incorporation of this material in manuals. And that service providers are really embedding this in their program. In regards to research, that this is conducted with practitioners, so with facilitators of behaviour change programs, the people who are working with perpetrators, and that also we're conducting research to make sure these educative and program needs are met. That we're working and doing research with facilitators, but also with people who perpetrate violence. And we're looking at identifying and guiding practitioner training and program development. And I want to acknowledge here the work of No to Violence in all of these fields, and they've also been really engaging with the tech industry and researchers already. So that is all of our recommendations, but I want to shout out to the many people who did provide assistance on this project and in the consultation phase, sharing their insights. And ideally what we hope is that these recommendations can be easily translated and that they offer a small ground about where to for next in research, in policy and practice.
Thank you very much, Bridget. That was great. And again, we'd like to thank the Melbourne Social Equity Institute for funding this project. They have been, I guess, it's more than the financial support of the seed funding. They have been very supportive of us early career researchers. We get invited to events where we can learn a little bit more. We get introduced to other people working in the field, and they really set up the majority of the presentation for today. So thank you especially to Claire, Kathleen and Charlene at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. We're now going to open up for questions, and I see that there are already 3 online. So I'm just going to head to those before I look to people in the room for their questions. So the first question that we have from Deb was, how were participants recruited? And online recruitment did occur. So we did lots of advertising online, in particular on places like Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. We had some fantastic organisations that promoted those tweets and posts and so forth, particularly the E-Safety Commissioner and No to Violence and Rose. So thank you very much to those organisations. We did notice that quite often when we put up a tweet, we would get a couple of people retweeting, and it always seemed to end up in a couple of participants going online and doing the survey. So with that, each of the advertisements actually had a QR code where they could go onto our website that we had established. And on that website, it gave them information about the study. It gave a really clear definition of the fact that people were going to have to spend up to half an hour writing a couple of stories. And it obviously outlined the inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. And then they could also get the links to the plain language statement and to the consent form. It was only at that point that if someone wanted to go ahead, that they would then request to be sent the link to the story stems. Anything else to add to that?
Probably just that we did have to go through several waves of recruitment to get the number of participants we did. There was some weirdnesses around numbers of participants in research at that time, because it was during the first 2/3 of 2020, which was a very strange time to be doing research generally. But I think we probably did pick up some participants who were in the board at home mode. But we also probably missed out participants who were just overwhelmed, and it may have created a little bit of sample bias around what was going on for our participants.
Probably one thing I also should mention was that we spoke about that, they're a fairly well-educated group. And there was one advertisement that went out through the University of Melbourne. So I wonder how much influence that had on the group. So, yeah. Okay, go ahead. I'll come back to the other online questions in just a moment. So, Annie.
Yeah. Can I ask, why did you choose to do 2 story stems? It was going to take 30 minutes. It's quite a long time. And I would anticipate you thought there would be a bit of drop off, people not wanting to commit that long. Why not halve it and just do the one?
Really good question. Did you want to answer that one?
Well, I think really we were looking to not just present one story, but to present a range of scenarios and to give participants the opportunity to engage with the stories as they felt inclined to do so. I think if you just present one story, if the story stem is not the perfect story stem, you risk losing out on the entire piece of research really, or biasing the responses. So having that variety in the story stems, I think, is pretty important, particularly with a study like this where it's almost raised more questions than answers in some ways. It's a very early piece of research in this field of perpetration of these harmful sorts of behaviours. So I think if we had have targeted it too closely, we may have missed something. So that variety I think is important. Open to anybody else's comments around that.
Yeah, I guess we needed something that we needed to see if there was a bit of consistency in response, but also have some other scenarios as well. It was really interesting that one story that was the consistent one, we did get we saw some stories go to all sorts of places that I never would have anticipated. So I think it was good to have one that was consistent and to see where people could go in their telling of stories about what harms may be chosen. But then to also have a look at the different avenues of tech facilitated abuse, because there are so many ways that you can use technology to harm. So we needed some other examples as well.
Also, one of the wonderful things about working with the MSCI is they have very strict guidelines about the use of anyone's time, including participants. So we were able to provide for half an hour a fairly decent honorarium as a thank you for their time. So it's not like we were asking them to give us half an hour free. I was hoping to tell you how long people actually took to complete the thing. I seem to remember that for most participants, completing 2 stories did take them under 15 minutes. I
think it was actually 17 minutes on average.
17 minutes on average. There we go. Renee's.
And the honorariums were $20, so they weren't substantial, but for half an hour
to
time,
influence.
You wouldn't think.
And the minimum stories were 250 words. Yeah. So we're not talking pages and pages and pages of writing.
So moving on to one of the online questions, we have had a lot of fraud. Sorry, this is from our good friend Kelsey. We've had a lot of fraud approaching perpetrators with people wanting to get honorarium for filling out surveys with quant qual questions. Some went to great lengths to look legitimate. Did you offer honorariums? As I just said, we offer $20 for the completion of the 2 stories and advise them to take up to half an hour. And as I said, about 17 minutes on average. We did do a few things though, as Dana had indicated. Oh, actually, no, it was Cynthia, sorry. There were the unique identifiers that we used. And we also got people to provide their email address so that we could send them out the $20 honorarium as well. We noticed that there were a few people that didn't realise till the end that they would not just be able to make up a unique identifier and not just be able to make up an email if they wanted to receive a voucher. So there were, I think it was 13 to 15 that we ended up being able to exclude because of the fact that it was obvious that So it's a huge problem, and I'm interested to talk to other people about how you do overcome this, because we really need to do this work with perpetrators, and yet it's so difficult to be able to get them to engage.
So a couple more points on this. We did set up the survey to be specifically one device, one participant. So essentially we were, blocking second responses from the same IP address within a certain time frame to limit people just going, I'll do 5 or 6 of these and there's my night out taken care of. But unfortunately, story completion as a method is now going to be very difficult. I did put our stories into ChatGPT to see what would happen. For the generic story, ChatGPT actually did give excellent advice. It said, you shouldn't touch your partner's devices. Go to bed, sleep, have a conversation in the morning. But for some of the other stories, it did write some things that I found pretty questionable. But of course, for participants who know about ChatGPT, and particularly how to prompt nudge it to say, I'll write it as though I'm this type of person or that type of person, this fraudulent thing is going to become an increasing problem for story completion. I mean, ChatGPT is almost engineered to do this type of work. So I feel like we were very lucky to run this when we did, and that we might not be able to do it now.
Yeah, it was during lockdown too. I mean, the other alternative is that you engage with people in particular settings, for instance, behaviour change programs. That has pros and cons, but that is another possibility.
Yeah. I might throw to you for the next question, Bridget. If you had 2 recs to highlight specifically from this piece of research findings, we did come up with a lot of recommendations, didn't we? But if you had 2 recommendations to highlight, what would they be?
I think my first would be around safety by design, because I think the Safety Commissioner has done brilliant work there, has achieved a lot of change. And it's bad press for a lot of, especially our big platforms, if they're not taking into account users. So it's a way that we can try and affect change. And there just is a lot of, we shouldn't be doing things like, I mean, when AirTags were released, I think everyone in the DB sector immediately went, well, that's going to be terrible. And it's just having those conversations earlier and engaging with all users. But what I'd really emphasise is that I think our platforms need to be better at engaging with diverse users so that we have a real understanding of everyone's experience. But I'd say that would be one. Maybe the second, I think, and this is also probably driven by my work with survivors, but the second is probably around more justice system training, because I think there is still this perception. There has been a lot of focus on physical and sexual violence. There's this idea that it's not as serious or it's not a problem. There are huge impacts on people's health, wellbeing, sense of security. There's also links to fatal violence. So there's opportunities for us to intervene. And just at the moment, there's such a burden on survivors to do what we call this safety work, to really spend a lot of time and energy and resources. And if you think about how dramatically your life would change if you couldn't do anything on technology, it changes what you do for work, education, socialising, shopping, all your bills and everything. It radically means that you have to change your life in ways that aren't fair. And so I think that we need to be thinking about all of the ways that we can take the burdens of victim survivors, protect and empower people. But then I feel like I should also say, I'm going to choose 3, primary prevention as well, because we need to think about the drivers of violence. And it's really great that we've had so much focus on responses and trying to improve people's responses, but we really need to prevent violence at its core. So I'm going to choose 3 and those 3.
Thanks, Bridget. Okay.
We did any question in the room.
We do? Great.
There's only me, yeah. I've got a gazillion questions, but I won't dominate your time. But I was curious as to whether you ran or piloted the narrative method with non-perpetrator type audiences, and whether that made a difference or gave you the same kind of richness of data. Because I tend to, I guess, find that with my work with young adults and financial abuse is often they didn't even realise it was financial abuse, and there is that incredible mix of, I guess, the issue of love and relationships and expectations and trust and mistrust, and not having the kind of, I guess, commitment in those early phases of relationships, and whether you're able to control or tease out those aspects as well.
So we did pilot it. We piloted it with 12 people, and there was a gender mix there. There was an age mix. I did actually have someone that I know who was only 17 at the time. Mind you, we'd made the decision to go with 18 and over. She absolutely loved it, and her story was really complicated and went for hours, and I thought, you've been watching too much television. But no, it was the piloting process. We got a reasonable amount of good feedback on the piloting process, and there were people that we've mentioned in our report who we'd like to thank for giving us feedback on those, because we did learn that there were a couple of things we had to be careful with not leading, and I guess that we didn't have quite enough of a range of stories as well. People did feedback to us, I didn't see anything on this, and, you know, surely that's something that, you know, is being used fairly frequently. So,
I guess I was more asking about, like, if you use that kind of non-perpetrator, just everybody, everyday people, right? Because anybody could end up in that kind of scenario.
yes,
where
that
they
were
become the jilted lover or whatever it is, or whatever might happen.
Yeah.
Whether looked for those same kind of things, it's kind of like put yourself in their shoes, and then they start, you know, using their own, you know, morals. Well, if that was me, or it's a friend of mine, and, you know, I would do this and I would do that, you know. So whether that kind of, you know, because they're the things that are embedded, right? We've got all these values and potential behaviours embedded in us, and given the right set of scenarios, we might act on those and we might not. And I'm just wondering whether you're testing those scenarios with different populations to see whether the same kind of things come out without complicating, by trying to access perpetrators by accessing general population people, where you might find some perpetrators as opposed to actual perpetrators.
I think it was really important from our perspective as researchers to focus on the piloting people for the purposes of design of the study, as opposed to analysing and going through the process of analysing their responses. And then the study itself is for us to analyse the responses. So they're two quite different bodies of stories, if you like, that we didn't, and in fact wouldn't, because it wouldn't really be ethically sound for us to do that comparison. But that's absolutely not ignoring the fact that, yes, some of these behaviours are highly normalised, and particularly among young people who are learning how to be in relationship and navigating all of those things of insecurity and uncertainty and jealousy, and, you know, they're still learning how to be in relationship with people. That's why some of these behaviours are so really very devastating among young people, particularly because of those complexities.
And who also might have had their parents using this technology to monitor them, right? Like, so, so we're
At what point is it okay and is it not okay? As you're becoming a young adult, or
so I think you point to a real need, and something that I personally have increasingly been thinking is we need to understand what social norms are around the use of this type. I feel like it's all heading in the wrong direction, and it concerns me as a parent of two young kids, right? That by the time they grow up, this stuff will all be normal, and that really worries me. But I think understanding what the norms are and then figuring out whether those are the right norms is definitely an avenue for future research that is imperative, actually.
I don't think we had the same discussions from memory of emotion in the piloted surveys as we did in the surveys with people who perpetrated harm. They really, you know, they spoke about this sadness, this jealousy, this control.
This white hot rage.
Yeah.
we have another, I'm trying to answer the online ones, but we also have another question in the room.
No, my question is more about the parents. I run a program working with LGBT young people coming from refugee and asylum seeker background, and quite often young people come to my service, and there's this presentation of the parents and family abusing tech in terms of young person going out who still are not out, and from the community, and it sometimes brings shame back to our communities where parents use technology and as an abuse towards those kids. And it's quite a problem, because my program is done in the Southeast and Dandenong area to look at that, how that was facilitated between parents and child. Do you in your pilot come across
So we explicitly made the decision in this study to look at essentially adults in relationships, because there are some very complex things that happen in parent-child relationships and relationships where people are caring for elders, where there is a duty of care at some level to make sure this person is safe, and technology can support us in providing that duty of care. But in an adult relationship, there's those complexities, but you're absolutely right that looking at this type of abuse in other contexts is, again, vitally important to understand how we can support our LGBTIQ young people, how we can support elders experiencing coercion or abuse as well. So one of the people on the team was particularly interested in elder abuse, because I think untangling those problems is just as important, but way more complex, essentially.
Thank you for that question. And for those of you who are in the room, we are about to pop over the hallway and share some food, and we can continue our discussions there. Thank you to everyone who joined us online today. It's great to have you here. For the person who popped up the most recent question, I did try and answer it briefly. However, you are welcome to contact our team and we can put you in contact with Dr. Cynthia Brown, who has done a lot more work in that space around youth and the normalisation of TAR behaviours. Okay, thank you very much to everyone. We're going to finish there.